Come here, my little ones. That's it, keep coming. Good job, everyone.
He pulled up the nursery camera feed expecting to document another rule violation. Caregivers before Amber had quit in tears, stolen medications, posted his son's photos online for likes. So when he saw all three cribs empty and her kneeling in the center of the room, his jaw clenched. Then he saw them. His three fragile sons, the one specialists said might never support their own weight, stumbling toward her from different corners of the nursery, actually walking on legs the medical team had written off. Christopher's phone slipped from his hand. His back hit the leather chair. And the billionaire who had replaced hope with surveillance watched the impossible unfold on a screen 27 monitors wide. Christopher still remembered the exact moment Emma told him. 6 months before everything ended, she'd walked into his home office holding 3 ultrasound printouts, her face split between terror and joy. "We're having triplets," she'd said, and when his mouth opened in pure panic, she'd started laughing, that full-body laugh that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. I know. But Chris, we'll figure it out together." Together. That word had meant everything. They'd spent the next 6 months in a blur of preparation, converting the guest wing into a nursery, buying 3 of everything, reading books about multiples and sleep schedules and the chaos they were about to invite into their perfectly ordered lives. Emma had made lists, color-coded spreadsheets, meal plans for the first 3 months. Christopher had renovated the second floor, installed a state-of-the-art air filtration system, hired the best pediatrician in Houston on retainer. "You're building a fortress," Emma had teased him one night, 8 months pregnant and unable to sleep, watching him review contractor blueprints at 2 a.m. "I'm building them a safe place," he'd replied, pulling her close despite her protests that she was the size of a whale. "They need more than safe, Chris. They need happy. They'll have both. I promise." He'd meant it. God, he'd meant it. The delivery started 3 weeks early on a Tuesday night. Emma's water broke during dinner, and Christopher had driven to the hospital with one hand on the wheel and one hand gripping hers, telling her it would be fine, everything would be fine, their boys would be here soon, and they'd figure it out together, just like she'd said. But together ended at 11:47 p.m. The C-section had gone smoothly at first. Christopher stood beside Emma's head, stroking her hair, making stupid jokes to keep her calm, while the surgical team worked behind the blue drape. He heard the first cry, David, then the second, Thomas, then the third, Stephen. 3 sons. 3 perfect, screaming miracles. Emma was crying and laughing, asking are they okay? Are they breathing? And the nurses were saying yes, yes, 10 fingers and 10 toes each, and Christopher was thinking this was it. This was the moment their real life began. Then Emma's monitor started beeping. It was a small sound at first, easy to miss under the chaos of 3 newborns being assessed and cleaned. But Christopher noticed. He noticed everything when it came to Emma, the slight catch in her breath, the way her hands suddenly gripped his too tight, the flicker of confusion in her eyes. "I feel weird," she'd said. The beeping got faster. "BP dropping," someone said, their voice sharp and clinical. "We've got bleeding." Suddenly the room exploded into movement. Nurses appeared from nowhere. The doctor's voice rose in urgent commands Christopher's brain couldn't process. Numbers on Emma's monitor were falling. He could see them plummeting while machines shrieked warnings he didn't understand but knew were terrible. "Emma, stay with me," he kept saying, squeezing her hand. "Stay with me. We just started. You can't." "Promise me something," she'd whispered, her voice already fading. Her eyes found his, and he saw she knew. Somehow she knew. "Promise me you'll let them be happy, not just safe." "You're going to tell them yourself," Christopher said, his voice breaking. "Emma, you're going to. Promise me, Chris." I promise, but you have to stay, you have to." The monitor flatlined. The sound was impossibly loud and impossibly quiet at the same time. A single sustained note that meant everything had stopped. Christopher heard himself screaming her name, felt hands trying to pull him back as the crash team swarmed around her, watched them work with brutal efficiency, pumping her chest, shocking her heart, flooding her with medications whose names he'd never know. 15 minutes they tried. 15 minutes of Christopher standing against the wall, held back by a nurse whose face he'd never remember, watching his wife's body jolt and fall with each shock, while 3 tiny boys cried in warming beds across the room. already motherless and not old enough to know it. Time of death, 11:47 p.m. The doctor's voice was gentle when he said it, but Christopher barely heard him. The room had gone silent except for the babies. His sons. Emma's sons. 3 little boys who would never know the woman who'd made color-coded spreadsheets and laughed about figuring it out together. A nurse placed a bundle in his arms. Then another. Then another. 3 warm, squirming bodies that weighed nothing and everything. Christopher stood there holding his entire world while another nurse crossed the room and pulled a white sheet over Emma's face, erasing her in one gesture. "Mr. Miller, do you want us to call someone?" A voice asked. He couldn't answer, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at 3 tiny faces and wonder how he was supposed to do this alone. The next 3 days passed in a fog. There was a funeral to arrange while his sons fought for stability in the NICU. Emma's parents flew in from Seattle, their grief as sharp as his but somehow more functional. They made phone calls, received visitors, handled the details Christopher couldn't face. His business partner managed the company. His assistant managed everything else. And Christopher sat in the NICU, watching 3 incubators breathe for 3 boys who came too early, trying to understand how life could give and take so completely in a single night. On the 4th day, the pediatric team called a meeting. Christopher sat in a sterile conference room across from Dr. Patricia Hendricks and 2 specialists whose names he immediately forgot. There were charts on the table, X-rays backlit on the wall, numbers and graphs that seemed designed to deliver bad news in the most clinical way possible. "Mr. Miller, we need to discuss your son's prognosis," Dr. Hendricks began, her voice carrying that particular gentleness doctors use when they're about to shatter you. Christopher's hands gripped the armrests. "They're breathing on their own now." "That's good, right?" "They are, which is encouraging. But we've identified some serious concerns. All 3 boys have chronic respiratory issues complicated by their premature birth. Their lungs are significantly underdeveloped, and preliminary assessments show reduced elasticity and compromised function." The words felt like a foreign language. Christopher forced himself to focus. What does that mean? Long term. The pause that followed was worse than anything she might have said. It means they'll require extensive medical intervention, round-the-clock monitoring, strict environmental controls to minimize pathogen exposure, careful regulation of activity levels to prevent respiratory distress. We're talking about a very regimented care protocol. For how long? Another pause. Potentially their entire lives. The room tilted slightly. Christopher gripped the table edge. But they'll be normal. They'll be able to run and play and go to school and... "Mr. Miller." Dr. Hendricks leaned forward, her eyes kind but unflinching. "I need to be honest with you. This condition is severe. Will they survive? Yes, with proper care. Will they have a normal childhood? That's unlikely. Our goal is to give them the best quality of life possible given the constraints of their diagnosis. Quality of life. Not a full life. Not the life Emma had imagined when she'd placed her hand on her swollen belly and talked about teaching them to swim, to be brave, to be happy. What do I need to do?" Christopher asked, his voice hollow. They gave him a list. Medical equipment, specialized caregivers, environmental modifications, monitoring systems, emergency protocols. The list was 3 pages long and read like instructions for running a small hospital. Christopher took it home to the mansion he'd bought to raise a family and saw it with new eyes. Every room would need modification, every surface sanitized, every visitor screened. The nursery he'd built with love and anticipation needed to become a medical facility. He started that night. By the end of the week, the mansion had been transformed. Hospital-grade air filtration in every room. Medical monitoring systems connected to a central hub. Cribs that looked more like miniature ICU beds. Oxygen hookups on standby. And cameras. Cameras everywhere. In the nursery. In the hallways. At every entrance. Feeding directly to a wall of monitors in what used to be his office. Christopher told himself it was about safety. About being able to respond instantly to any emergency. About making sure nothing was missed, no symptom overlooked, no crisis undetected. But late at night, sitting in front of those 27 glowing screens, watching his 3 sons sleep under layers of monitoring equipment, he knew the truth. He was building a fortress not just to protect them, but to protect himself. Because if he could control every variable, monitor every moment, prevent every possible danger through sheer vigilance and technology, then maybe, he wouldn't lose them too. Emma had asked him to let them be happy, not just safe. Christopher was doing everything in his power to keep them safe. Happy would have to wait until he figured out how to breathe again. Christopher kept a file on every caregiver who'd walked through his door. 12 manila folders lined up in his desk drawer like a catalog of failure. He could recite each one from memory, the dates they'd started, the reasons they'd left or been removed, the specific moments when he'd realized they wouldn't work out. Genevieve had been first. 52 years old, 20 years of pediatric nursing experience, impeccable references. She'd lasted exactly 14 days. Christopher remembered watching her on the monitors during her second week, seeing the way her eyes would dart to the cameras mounted in every corner of the nursery. She'd started positioning herself with her back to them while changing the boys, angling her body to block the view. On day 13, he'd called her into his office to discuss protocol adherence. "Mr. Miller, I can't do this," she'd said before he could speak. Her hands were shaking. "I feel like I'm being watched every second. Because I am. I can't even breathe without wondering if you're analyzing my breathing patterns." "The cameras are for the boys' safety," Christopher had replied, his voice flat. "Surely you understand that. I understand you have more cameras in this house than most casinos. I understand I can't make a single decision without second-guessing whether you're watching me make it. I'm a good nurse, Mr. Miller, but I can't work like this." She'd walked out crying, and Christopher had added a note to her file. Insufficient tolerance for necessary oversight. Caregiver number 2 lasted 6 days. Number 3, Marcus, made it almost a month. Marcus had seemed perfect on paper. Male caregiver, former military medic, comfortable with structure and routine. Christopher had felt almost optimistic. Then he'd installed the analytics software. The program tracked everything: time spent in each room, duration of each care task, frequency of phone usage. Christopher told himself it was about optimization, about ensuring the boys receive consistent, high-quality attention. The data told a different story. Marcus was spending 14% more time on his phone than his contract allowed. Small increments, 2 minutes here, 3 minutes there, but they added up. Christopher had confronted him with a printed report, complete with timestamps and photographic evidence. "You're firing me over 6 minutes a day?" Marcus had asked, incredulous. "I'm firing you for breach of contract. You signed an agreement stipulating minimal personal device usage during working hours. The data shows clear violation of that agreement." "Mr. Miller, I was looking up pediatric care techniques. Half those phone searches were medical questions about your sons. Then you should have asked me first." Marcus had left without another word, and Christopher had refined the analytics program to distinguish between personal and professional phone usage. The next caregiver would have even less room for deviation. Numbers 4 through 6 blurred together. Too soft, too rigid, too uncomfortable with the medical equipment. One had questioned his protocols, suggesting the boys might benefit from more natural developmental opportunities, whatever that meant. Christopher had terminated her contract before she finished the sentence. Then came Jennifer, caregiver number 7. 29 years old, pediatric certification, warm references from 3 previous families. She'd made it 3 months, longer than anyone else. Christopher had started to relax, just slightly. Started to think maybe he'd found someone who understood what these boys needed. He'd even begun trusting her. Small things at first, letting her make minor scheduling adjustments, accepting her suggestions about feeding positions, not reviewing every second of footage from her shifts. The boys seemed to respond to her. David would smile when she entered the room. Thomas would settle faster when she held him. Stephen actually seemed to enjoy tummy time when Jennifer made it into a game. Christopher had allowed himself to hope. Then came the Tuesday afternoon when his phone pinged with an alert. Someone had tagged his home address on social media. He'd opened Instagram and felt his blood turn to ice. Jennifer's account. Public. 11 photos of his sons. David propped against colorful pillows with a caption reading, "Cutest client ever." Thomas mid-laugh with, "This little guy makes my job so worth it." Stephen sleeping with my precious patient looking like an angel. Each photo showed his sons' faces clearly. Their medical equipment visible in the background. Their vulnerability displayed for 3,847 followers to see. Christopher had walked to the nursery. Jennifer was singing to Stephen, completely unaware. "Get out," he'd said from the doorway, his voice deadly quiet. "Mr. Miller, I don't. Get out of my house. Now. Don't touch them. Don't speak. Just leave." She tried to explain, tried to say she'd thought it was fine, that she hadn't used their names, that lots of caregivers posted about their work. Christopher had called his lawyer before she reached her car. She was served with a lawsuit by 6 p.m., breach of privacy, violation of confidentiality, emotional distress. The photos came down within an hour. The damage to Christopher's ability to trust took considerably longer to repair. He'd installed 4 more cameras after Jennifer. Hired caregivers 8, 9, and 10 in rapid succession. None lasted more than 3 weeks. One quit after discovering the bathroom cameras. Another after Christopher corrected her diaper-changing technique via intercom at 2 a.m. The third never showed up for her second day. Then came Robert, caregiver number 11. The final straw. Robert had come with 15 years of experience and a specialty in medically complex children. Christopher had been thorough in his vetting, background checks, reference calls, even a consultation with the boy's pediatrician about Robert's qualifications. Everything checked out. Robert made it 6 weeks. Long enough for Christopher to start developing a routine around his schedule. Long enough to stop watching every single second of footage. That's why he almost missed it. Christopher had been reviewing the previous night's recordings at double speed, a habit he developed to save time, when something made him pause and rewind. Robert in the medication room, preparing the boys' evening doses. Christopher slowed the footage to normal speed and felt his stomach drop. Robert was pouring from the wrong bottles. The adult dose acetaminophen instead of infant drops. The dosage that could cause liver failure in children under 2. Christopher watched in horror as Robert filled 3 syringes with liquid that could kill his sons. His hand was already reaching for his phone when the alarm sounded. The redundant monitoring system he'd installed after caregiver number 4, the one that cross-checked all medication against the boys' charts and weights. Robert froze on camera as the alert blared through the house. He looked at the bottles, at the syringes, and his face went white as he realized his mistake. Christopher was in the nursery within 30 seconds. "Put them down. Now." "Mr. Miller, I didn't. I was just about to double-check. You were about to poison my sons. Get out. If you're not gone in 60 seconds, I'm calling the police." Robert had left at a run. Christopher had sat on the nursery floor between 3 cribs, his whole body shaking, thinking about how close he'd come to losing them. How one man's carelessness, one moment of inattention, could have ended everything. He'd installed 17 additional cameras that night, covered every possible angle of every room, added pharmaceutical tracking software that required fingerprint authorization for the medication cabinet, created redundant monitoring systems for the redundant monitoring systems. No more risks. No more humans making human errors. Just protocols and the unblinking eye of surveillance. When the agency called about caregiver number 12, Christopher almost declined the interview. What was the point? They all failed eventually. They all proved his worst fear, that trusting another person with what mattered most was an unacceptable risk. But the boys needed care, and he couldn't do it alone. So he agreed to meet Amber Torrey, fully expecting her to become folder number 12 in his drawer of disappointments. The interview was scheduled for 15 minutes. Christopher had perfected the routine. Show them the contract, 47 pages of protocols, restrictions, and surveillance clauses. Walk them through the camera system. Detail the medical complexity. Most candidates left before he finished page 3. Amber had sat through the entire presentation without flinching. When he'd finished, she'd simply said, "May I see them?" "Excuse me. Your sons. May I meet them before we discuss terms?" Christopher had blinked. No one had ever asked that. The interview process is, "I understand you have procedures, Mr. Miller, but I need to know if I'm right for them, not if they're right for me. If I can't connect with your boys, the rest of this doesn't matter." Something in her directness had intrigued him. He'd agreed, more out of curiosity than expectation, and pulled up the nursery feed on his monitor. "I'll watch from here. Standard protocol." "Of course," Amber had said, and left without a trace of the camera consciousness that had plagued Genevieve. Christopher had watched her walk down the hall, her stride calm and purposeful. She'd entered the nursery and paused, taking in the medical equipment, the monitors, the 3 cribs arranged in precise formation. Most caregivers hesitated here, intimidated. Amber had simply walked forward. She'd knelt beside Thomas's crib first. "Thomas, who startled easily, who rarely looked at new people, who seemed to fold into himself whenever someone unfamiliar approached. "Hello, brave one," Amber had whispered, her voice barely picked up by the audio feed. "I'm Amber. If you'll have me, I'd like to help take care of you." Christopher had leaned closer to his monitor, expecting Thomas to turn away, to cry, to show the same fearful response he gave everyone else. Instead, Thomas had looked directly at her, held her gaze for 3 full seconds, an eternity for a child who avoided eye contact. Something in Christopher's chest had tightened painfully. Amber had moved to David's crib next, then Stephen's, speaking softly to each boy, not touching them without permission, not overwhelming them with forced cheerfulness. Just present, attentive, real. When she'd returned to his office, Christopher had already made his decision, even as every instinct screamed at him to find someone more clinical, more detached, someone who wouldn't look at his sons like they were children instead of medical cases. "When can you start?" he'd asked. Amber had smiled. "I'll need to give my current family 2 weeks' notice." "Is that acceptable?" "Yes." Christopher had slid the contract across his desk, already regretting this, already knowing she'd fail like all the others, already preparing folder number 12 in his mind. But Thomas had looked at her. His son, who looked at no one, had looked at her. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Or maybe he was just setting himself up for disappointment number 12. Amber's first violation occurred on day 3. Christopher's audio analysis software flagged it at 2:47 p.m. Non-protocol vocalizations detected in nursery sector. He'd been in a conference call with his Singapore office when the alert came through. He'd muted his line and pulled up the footage, expecting to find Amber on a personal phone call or perhaps talking to someone outside the authorized communication channels. Instead, he found her humming. She was changing David's diaper, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through the steps Christopher had outlined in the care manual: wipes, cream, fresh diaper, fasten, dispose. But the whole time, she was humming. Some melody Christopher didn't recognize, soft and rhythmic, almost under her breath. David was watching her face, his expression more alert than Christopher had seen in weeks. Christopher replayed the footage 3 times, searching the care protocols for a specific prohibition against humming. Technically, there wasn't one. The manual specified minimal unnecessary vocalization during routine care tasks to avoid overstimulation, but humming existed in a gray area between speech and silence. He opened Amber's digital file and added a note. Day 3, excessive personalization of care tasks. Humming during diaper change. Not explicitly forbidden, but inconsistent with care philosophy. Monitor for pattern. The pattern emerged by the end of week 1. Christopher's motion tracking software generated a report every evening, documenting the duration of each care activity. Feeding sessions were particularly tracked. The boys needed precise amounts at precise intervals, and the post-feeding holding period was calibrated to 15 minutes for burping and settling before returning them to their cribs. Amber was exceeding the holding duration on every single feeding. 8 minutes over with David, 12 minutes over with Stephen, 10 minutes over with Thomas. Every time, Christopher had watched the footage, trying to identify what she was doing during those extra minutes. She wasn't feeding them more, the bottles were empty. She wasn't burping them, that happened in the first 5 minutes. She was just holding them, swaying slightly, sometimes humming again, sometimes talking in a voice too soft for the microphones to capture clearly. On day 7, he'd had enough. He'd waited until she was mid-violation. Stephen had finished his bottle 17 minutes ago, and she was still holding him, rocking in the chair by the window, and pressed the intercom button. "Ms. Torrey, please adhere to the prescribed holding durations." Amber had looked up at the camera, no surprise on her face. She'd known he was watching. Of course she had. Everyone knew he was always watching. "Mr. Miller," she'd said, her voice clear and steady. Stephen still nestled against her shoulder. "With respect, your sons need more than what can be prescribed." Christopher's finger had hovered over the intercom button, ready to correct her, to remind her that she was hired to follow protocols, not to question them. But something in the way she'd said it, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual, had stopped him. He'd watched her hold Stephen for another 6 minutes before finally placing him in his crib. Stephen had fussed for 30 seconds, then settled into sleep more easily than he had in days. Christopher had added another note to her file. Day 7. repeated holding duration violations. When confronted, displayed insubordinate attitude. Claimed sons need more than protocols provide. Concerning. The file was getting longer. The violations were adding up. And yet Christopher found himself reviewing footage of Amber's shifts more than any previous caregiver. Not to document failures, but to understand what she was doing that made the boys so calm. Week 2 started with music. Christopher was in the middle of a critical board meeting, a merger worth $200 million that required his full attention, when his phone started buzzing. Not just one alert. 7, 8, 12 alerts in rapid succession, each one flagged urgent by his monitoring system. "Excuse me," he'd said, standing abruptly. "I need to take this." He'd stepped into the hallway and pulled up the nursery feed, his heart hammering with worst-case scenarios. Medical emergency. Equipment failure. Intruder. His mind cataloged disasters as the video loaded. What he saw made no sense. Amber had brought a small Bluetooth speaker into the nursery. It sat on the changing table, completely unauthorized, playing something Christopher's audio recognition software identified as Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Classical piano, gentle and melodic, filling the room at a volume his decibel monitors flagged as above baseline ambient noise levels. All 3 boys were on the floor, positioned for tummy time, something they usually hated. Thomas especially would cry within 60 seconds of being placed on his stomach, his face reddening with frustration and discomfort. But Thomas wasn't crying. None of them were crying. Christopher stood in the corporate hallway, phone gripped in his hand, watching his sons lie calm and alert on their activity mats. Thomas's eyes were tracking Amber's movements as she encouraged him to reach for a toy. David was pushing up slightly on his forearms, something the physical therapist had said might take another month to achieve. Stephen was just listening, his face turned toward the speaker, peaceful. Christopher's thumbs moved to the messaging interface. He typed, "Unauthorized equipment. Remove immediately." His finger hovered over send. On screen, Amber was singing along now, her voice blending with the piano. She was doing the range of motion exercises the physical therapist had prescribed, but she'd turned them into a game, moving the boys' legs in time with the music, making it play instead of therapy. Thomas was still calm. 17 minutes into tummy time, and he was still calm. Christopher didn't send the message. He returned to the boardroom, mumbled an apology about a home emergency that turned out to be nothing, and tried to focus on merger terms and profit projections. But his mind was in the nursery, watching 3 boys experience something he'd never thought to give them. During the lunch break, he'd pulled up the live feed again. The music was still playing. Amber had moved on to feeding time, but the speaker remained, Chopin replaced by something softer, a cello piece his software identified as Bach. Christopher watched for 47 minutes. He watched his sons eat and settle and play and exist in a room filled with sound that served no medical purpose, provided no therapeutic benefit, existed only because it was beautiful. When had he last given them anything just because it was beautiful? The question sat uncomfortably in his chest as he returned to the meeting, as he shook hands and signed papers and built his empire while his sons discovered music for the first time. That night, he'd added another note to Amber's file. Day 9, brought unauthorized equipment Bluetooth speaker into nursery. Played unauthorized audio during care routines and therapy sessions. Did not remove despite clear protocol violations. Boys showed unusual calmness during typically difficult activities. Correlation unclear. Monitoring. By day 12, Christopher's file on Amber Tory was the longest he'd ever compiled on a caregiver. Pages of documented violations, each one technically terminable, each one building a case for dismissal that should have been airtight. He'd printed the termination papers on a Thursday morning, filled out the forms citing repeated and willful disregard for established care protocols, signed his name at the bottom, walked down the hallway toward the nursery with the papers in hand and his decision made. This had gone on long enough. She was too warm, too personal, too willing to deviate from the plan that kept his sons safe. The next caregiver would be different. More clinical, more obedient, more afraid. Christopher had reached the nursery door and raised his hand to knock, to call Amber out and hand her the papers and end this before she caused real damage. Then he'd heard it. Laughter. Not the reflexive sounds the doctors had described. Neurological responses that mimicked joy without containing it. Real laughter. the sound of a child discovering something delightful and responding with pure, unfiltered happiness. Thomas. Thomas was laughing. Christopher's hand had frozen on the door handle. He'd stood in his own hallway, outside his own son's room, listening to a sound he couldn't remember creating himself in 2 years of fatherhood. Through the door, he could hear Amber's voice, playful and animated. There it is. Did you see it? The ball went so high. More laughter from Thomas. Then David joining in, his laugh different, higher, more rhythmic. Then Stephen, not laughing but making sounds of engagement, of presence, of being alive in a way that transcended the careful management of his respiratory condition. Christopher had stood there for 5 minutes. The termination papers had grown damp in his grip. On the other side of the door, his sons were experiencing joy, and he was on the outside of it, clutching paperwork that would end whatever magic was happening in there, return them to the quiet efficiency of protocol-based care. He'd realized, standing in that hallway, that he'd become a stranger in his own home, that he knew his sons' vital signs better than their personalities, that he could tell you their exact feeding schedule down to the milliliter, but couldn't tell you what made them laugh, that somewhere in his desperate attempt to keep them safe, he'd forgotten they were supposed to be living. Christopher had walked back to his office, his hand shaking. He'd opened his desk drawer, the one labeled pending, and filed the termination papers inside. Not in the trash, not shredded, just pending. A decision deferred, a question left open. He'd pulled up the nursery feed and watched Amber play with his sons, documenting another violation for a file he was no longer sure he'd ever use. Thomas was still laughing. The sound echoed through the speakers, into Christopher's office, into the hollow space in his chest where fatherhood was supposed to live. He'd added one final note to Amber's file that night. Day 12. Induced laughter in Thomas during play session. Mechanism unknown. Effect on respiratory function, positive. Effect on emotional development, unmeasured. Effect on father, complicated. Then he'd closed the file and sat in the darkness, surrounded by 27 glowing monitors, wondering when he'd stopped being a father and become a warden instead. Christopher gave up on sleep at 3:47 a.m. He'd been lying in bed for 2 hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the sound of Thomas's laughter on an endless loop. Finally, he'd thrown off the covers and walked to his office, telling himself he was just going to do a routine review of the day's footage. He pulled up the afternoon session first. Amber with David on the activity mat, working through what looked like playtime, but had that quality Christopher was beginning to recognize: structure hidden inside spontaneity, intention disguised as fun. He watched her move David's legs, bending them at the knee, rotating the hip joint, extending and flexing in patterns that seemed random until Christopher paused the video and zoomed in. 3 bends, hold for 2 seconds, release, repeat. Then a switch to the right leg. Same pattern. 3 bends, hold, release. Back to the left. The consistency was unmistakable once he saw it. Christopher opened a new browser tab. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he typed pediatric physical therapy techniques, chronic respiratory patients. The search results loaded. 17 million hits. He clicked the first link, a journal article from the American Physical Therapy Association. Then another. Then another. One tab became 5, became 12. By 4:23 a.m., Christopher was 17 pages deep into a medical journal article about neuroplasticity in infants with chronic conditions. The language was dense, heavy with terminology he had to look up in separate tabs, but the core message was clear. Infant brains were extraordinarily adaptive. Neural pathways that seemed fixed could be rewired with proper stimulation. Developmental windows existed, critical periods where intervention could produce dramatic results. But those windows didn't stay open forever. He clicked another link. This one was a meta-analysis of care approaches for medically complex infants. The abstract made his chest tight. Studies consistently demonstrate that infants receiving consistent loving contact in addition to medical care show improved outcomes across multiple metrics, including motor development, cognitive function, emotional regulation, and even immune response compared to infants receiving medical care alone. Christopher read that sentence 3 times. Loving contact. Not just care. Not just protocol. Love. He thought about his fortress of cameras and protocols. About the way he designed every aspect of his sons' lives around minimizing risk, maximizing control, eliminating the human variables that might fail them. He thought about the 11 caregivers who'd come before Amber, how he'd wanted them detached, clinical, afraid, how he'd fired or driven away anyone who showed signs of getting too emotionally involved. Another article loaded. This one discussed the role of multisensory stimulation in respiratory development. Music, touch, visual engagement. The research suggested that infants exposed to rich sensory environments showed improved lung capacity and better breathing patterns than those kept in sterile, understimulated settings. Christopher's monitor showed the nursery, dark now, his 3 sons sleeping in their cribs, their breathing measured by machines that fed data to his surveillance system. He'd built them the most medically advanced nursery in Houston, maybe in Texas, and according to the research he was reading, he might have been hurting them the entire time. He opened another tab, then another. The sun was starting to lighten the sky outside his window, but Christopher barely noticed. He was learning about developmental psychology, about attachment theory, about the critical importance of the first 2 years of life for establishing neural pathways that would affect his sons for the rest of their existence. At 5:15 a.m., he found the TED Talk, The Failure of Protocol-Only Care by Dr. Marianne Shun, pediatric development specialist at Stanford. The thumbnail showed a woman in her 50s standing on the red dot, the title in white text behind her. Christopher clicked play. Dr. Chin started with a case study. Triplets born premature with severe respiratory complications. Christopher's hand froze on his coffee mug. The parents were terrified, Dr. Chin said, her voice warm but authoritative. Understandably so. They did everything the medical team recommended. Strict protocols, environmental controls, minimal stimulation to avoid stressing the infant's compromised systems. By 6 months, the triplets were stable but showing significant developmental delays. Christopher leaned closer to the screen. Then we introduced what we call enhanced social-emotional intervention. We didn't change the medical care, same medications, same monitoring, same safety protocols. But we added touch, music, play. We trained the parents and caregivers in infant massage, in reading developmental cues, in creating moments of joy within the medical regimen. Dr. Chun clicked to the next slide. 2 graphs, side by side. This shows the standard care group versus the enhanced care group after 12 months. Look at these metrics: motor development, respiratory function, cognitive engagement. The enhanced group showed marked improvements across every measure. The difference in the graphs was dramatic. The enhanced care group's lines climbed steadily upward while the protocol-only group plateaued or declined. But here's what the data can't fully capture, Dr. Chin continued. The enhanced care infants smiled more, laughed more, showed curiosity about their environment. They engaged with their caregivers in ways that suggested not just survival, but thriving. Because that's what we learned. These medically fragile children didn't just need to be kept alive. They needed reasons to want to live. Christopher's hands were shaking. He paused the video and replayed that last sentence. They needed reasons to want to live. He thought about his sons lying in their cribs surrounded by the best medical equipment money could buy, monitored 24 hours a day, kept safe and sterile and completely, utterly unstimulated beyond what was strictly necessary for survival. What reasons had he given them to want to live? He finished the TED Talk, then watched it again, taking notes this time. By the time he heard Amber's car pulling into the driveway at 6 a.m., Christopher had filled 3 pages with scribbled observations, questions, research citations he wanted to follow up on. He heard her footsteps in the hallway, heard her pause at the nursery door. She always did that, always took a moment before entering, like she was preparing herself to be fully present. Christopher stood abruptly and walked out of his office. He met her outside the nursery, and the intensity on his face made her stop. "Where did you train?" Christopher demanded, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Amber set down her bag slowly, her expression calm. "Houston Community College. I have my CNA certification and pediatric specialty training. You have all my credentials on file, Mr. Miller. That doesn't explain what you're doing with my sons." "What do you mean?" "The leg exercises. The specific patterns. The music. The holding durations that exceed protocol. Where did you learn those techniques?" Amber held his gaze steadily. "Some of it from my training. Some from continuing education courses. Some from just paying attention to what works. What makes them comfortable? What helps them grow? And the rest," Christopher's voice cracked slightly, "the parts that aren't in any manual." "Mr. Miller, Amber said softly. I'm loving them. That's what they need that the machines can't give them. Christopher wanted to argue. Wanted to cite the protocols that 3 different specialists had designed. Wanted to pull out the medical opinions that said minimal stimulation, maximum monitoring, strict adherence to clinical care plans. But he'd just spent 3 hours reading research that contradicted all of it. That said everything Amber was doing, the unauthorized music, the excessive holding, the gentle exercises disguised as play, was exactly what his sons needed. Do you think they can get better? The question came out quieter than he'd intended, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be since Emma died. Amber was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I think they can be more than their diagnosis. I think David and Thomas and Stephen are 3 individual boys with their own potential, their own paths. But only if someone believes it's possible. Only if someone gives them the space and support to become whoever they're meant to be. The doctors said. I know what the doctors said, Mr. Miller. I've read their reports. You keep copies in the care binder. Amber's voice was gentle but firm. The doctors told you about limitations and risks and worst-case scenarios. Because that's their job, to prepare you for the hardest outcomes. But they don't live with David and Thomas and Stephen every day. They don't see Thomas's face when he hears music. They don't feel how David's muscles are getting stronger week by week. They don't know that Stephen responds better to touch when you hum while you hold him. How do you know that? About Stephen. Because I pay attention. Because I'm present with them, not just monitoring them. Amber paused. Mr. Miller, can I ask you something? When was the last time you held one of your sons without checking a monitor first? The question hit like a physical blow. Christopher opened his mouth to answer and realized he couldn't remember. I'm not criticizing, Amber continued. I can't imagine what you've been through. Losing your wife, raising 3 medically complex infants alone, carrying all that fear and responsibility. But your boys need more than safety. They need their father. Christopher felt something cracking in his chest, the careful distance he'd maintained, the clinical detachment that let him function without feeling. I don't know how to do that anymore, he admitted, the words costing him everything. I don't know how to be present without being terrified. Then maybe that's what we work on next, Amber said. Together. If you'll let me help with that too. Christopher nodded, not trusting his voice. He stepped back, let Amber enter the nursery to start her shift. But instead of returning to his office, to his wall of monitors and his files of documentation, he did something he hadn't done in months. He walked to the kitchen, made coffee, sat at the breakfast table where Emma used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings. And he didn't check the monitors for 4 hours. When he finally pulled up the feed at 10 a.m., it was just to see his sons' faces, not to document violations or catalog failures. Thomas was laughing at something Amber was doing with a stuffed animal. David was reaching for a toy with determination written across his small face. Stephen was watching his brothers, his expression alert and engaged. Christopher watched them for 10 minutes, then closed the laptop. They were okay. More than okay. They were living. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn to do the same. The emergency call came at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. Christopher was reviewing quarterly projections when his CFO's name flashed across his screen with a red flag that meant crisis. We have a problem in Chicago, Marcus said without preamble. The Hartwell acquisition is falling apart. They're threatening to walk if you don't fly out tonight, and close this personally. Christopher's stomach dropped. Tonight. The meeting's tomorrow at 9 a.m. If we lose Hartwell, we lose the entire Midwest expansion. Chris, this is $300 million on the line. Christopher looked at his wall of monitors. The boys were with Amber, doing their afternoon therapy session. Thomas was on his activity mat. David was in the bouncer. Stephen was having tummy time. Everything normal. Everything safe. I can't leave them overnight. I've never. I know. But this is the company, Chris. We need you there. Christopher closed his eyes. 2 years. 2 years he'd been within 100 feet of his sons at all times. 2 years of monitoring every breath, every moment, every possibility of something going wrong. Book the flight, he heard himself say. I'll be there. He packed in 15 minutes. Laptop, tablet, portable chargers, backup battery packs. He forwarded the security feeds to his phone, tested the connection 3 times, set up redundant alerts for any unusual activity. When he walked into the nursery to tell Amber, she was reading to the boys. All 3 were arranged around her, their attention fixed on her voice and the colorful pictures she was showing them. I have to go to Chicago, Christopher said abruptly. Emergency business. I'll be back tomorrow night. Amber looked up, and if she was surprised, she didn't show it. All right. We'll be fine here. I'll be monitoring everything. I've set up the feeds on my phone. I'll have alerts for any. Mr. Miller. Amber's voice was gentle. Have a safe flight. We'll be here when you get back. Christopher wanted to give her more instructions, more protocols, more assurance that he'd be watching even from 1,200 miles away. Instead, he just nodded and left before the tightness in his chest could turn into something worse. The entire flight to Chicago, Christopher watched the feeds. Dinner time, bath time, bedtime. He watched Amber move through the routines with the boys, watched them settle into sleep, watched the nursery go dark except for the soft glow of the night lights. Only then did he close his laptop and try to sleep. The morning meeting started at 9 a.m. sharp. Christopher had prepared for this, slides detailing the acquisition terms, profit projections, integration timelines. The Hartwell executives sat across the conference table, their expressions skeptical but engaged. Christopher was 43 slides into his presentation when his phone buzzed. Once, twice, 6 times in rapid succession. Motion detected nursery sector. Multiple heat signatures, unexpected positions. Unusual movement patterns alert. Christopher's mouth went dry. Excuse me for just a moment. He walked out of the conference room, his heart hammering against his ribs. Medical emergency. Equipment failure. Someone broke in. The possibilities cascaded through his mind as he pushed into the men's bathroom and pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He opened the security app and pulled up the nursery feed. All 3 cribs were empty. Christopher's vision tunneled. He checked the timestamp, 11:47 a.m. The boys should be in their cribs for their late morning nap. All 3 cribs should have small bodies in them. Instead, they were empty, and Amber was in the center of the room, kneeling on the floor with her arms open. Then Christopher saw them. From 3 different directions, Stephen by the changing table, David near the play mat, Thomas at the rocking chair. His sons were moving. Not crawling. Not scooting on their bottoms the way the physical therapist said might happen eventually. Walking. Stumbling, wobbling, grabbing at furniture for balance with chubby hands, but walking. Their legs were supporting their weight. Their feet were taking steps. Their bodies were doing what every doctor had said might not be possible for years, if ever. Stephen reached Amber first, his momentum carrying him forward until he fell into her arms. She caught him with a laugh Christopher couldn't hear through his AirPods. Then David, his small face split between concentration and pure joy, taking 3 more steps before Amber's other arm wrapped around him. Finally Thomas. Thomas, who had the worst respiratory issues. Thomas, who the specialist said had the most significant muscle weakness. Thomas, who Christopher had been certain would face the longest road to any kind of normal development. Thomas took 6 shaky, determined steps across the nursery floor before his knees buckled and Amber caught him against her chest. Christopher's phone slipped from his hand and clattered against the bathroom tile. He braced himself against the sink, his reflection staring back at him from the mirror. A stranger looked out at him, a man in an expensive suit who'd just watched his sons achieve the impossible through a 3-inch screen. A man who'd been so busy monitoring life that he'd missed his children learning to live it. The bathroom door opened. His assistant, Greg, poked his head in. Chris, they're waiting. Are you okay? I have to go home. What? The presentation's not finished. We haven't even gotten to the term negotiations. I have to go home now. Christopher picked up his phone, his hands still shaking. Charter a flight. Tell them something came up. Chris, this is $300 million. I don't care. Christopher pushed past him into the hallway. My sons just took their first steps, and I wasn't there. I watched it on a goddamn phone screen in a bathroom 1,200 miles away because I've spent 2 years being too terrified to actually live with them. He was already walking toward the elevators, already pulling up charter flight services on his phone. What do I tell the Hartwell people? Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them we'll reschedule. Tell them whatever you want. The elevator doors opened, and Christopher stepped inside. I'm going home to my sons. The charter flight took 2 hours. Christopher sat alone in the small cabin, his laptop open to the frozen frame of Thomas mid-step, and finally did what he hadn't allowed himself to do since Emma's funeral. He cried. Not the silent, controlled tears he sometimes permitted himself in the shower at 3 a.m. Not the tight-throated grief he swallowed down when he looked at old photos. But wrenching, body-shaking sobs that echoed in the empty cabin and came from somewhere so deep he hadn't known it was still inside him. He cried for Emma, who never got to see her son smile, who died believing she'd left them fragile and uncertain, who never knew they'd grow strong enough to walk, to laugh, to live. He cried for the 2 years he'd spent hiding behind cameras and protocols instead of being present with his children. He cried for the father he used to be, the one who'd renovated a house with joy instead of turning it into a fortress with fear. He cried until there was nothing left, until the pilot's voice came over the intercom saying they'd be landing in 15 minutes, until he had to wipe his face and try to breathe normally again. Christopher's car pulled into the circular driveway at 2:14 a.m. The mansion was dark except for one window, the soft glow from the nursery. He didn't check the security feed, didn't pull up the app to see what he'd missed in the hours he'd been traveling, didn't review footage or verify that everything was okay. He just walked through his front door, climbed the stairs, and pushed open the nursery door. Amber was in the rocking chair, a baby monitor resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, and there was no surprise on her face. Like she'd been expecting him. "Mr. Miller, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Christopher's voice cracked when he spoke. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call me when they started walking?" Amber was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was gentle but firm. "Because you needed to see it yourself? Not through a camera. Through your own eyes, in your own time. I missed it. You saw it. That's what matters." Amber gestured to the 3 cribs where his sons slept peacefully. "And they'll walk again tomorrow. And the day after. And you can be here for those steps if you choose to be." Christopher looked at David, Thomas, and Stephen. Their small chests rose and fell in the rhythm he'd monitored obsessively for 2 years. The machines still tracked their breathing, their heart rates, their oxygen levels. But the boys sleeping in those cribs weren't the fragile, limited children he'd constructed in his mind. They were his sons, living, growing, capable of the impossible. He thought about Emma's last words. "Promise me you'll let them be happy, not just safe." "I want to be here," Christopher said. "Really here. Not watching through a screen." "Then be here," Amber said simply. "Starting tomorrow." Christopher nodded and left the nursery. But he didn't go to his office, to the wall of monitors that had become his entire world. He went to his bedroom, set his phone on the nightstand without checking the feeds one last time, and slept without nightmares for the first time in 2 years. He woke to the sound of laughter. Not from a monitor, but filtering down the hallway from the nursery. Real and immediate and happening in his home while he was in it. Christopher walked to the nursery still in his wrinkled clothes from yesterday and found Amber preparing the boys' breakfast while they played on their activity mat, pulling themselves up on the furniture rails, babbling to each other in their own language. "Mr. Miller." Amber looked up. "I have their schedule ready for review. We have physical therapy at 10, then." Christopher held up his hand. "Cancel it. Cancel today's schedule." "Sir, I'm taking them outside." Amber's smile was slow and bright and worth every failed acquisition in the world. "They'll need hats. It's sunny." Christopher gathered his sons, all 3 at once, something every protocol he'd written said he should never do. Too much risk. Too much strain. Too much possibility of dropping one or triggering a respiratory episode. But their combined weight felt right in his arms. Felt like what he should have been doing all along. He carried them through the mansion, through doors he'd kept them behind for 2 years, and out into the garden. The morning sun caught their dark hair, and they squinted, their faces scrunching up before breaking into smiles at this new bright world. Christopher set them down on a blanket in the grass and lay beside them. He pointed at clouds and birds and leaves, described the way the wind moved through the trees and how the flowers smelled and what colors he saw in the sky. Wonder filled his voice, wonder he'd thought grief had destroyed forever. David pulled himself up on Christopher's arm and took 3 wobbling steps before sitting down hard. Stephen laughed and reached for a dandelion. Thomas looked at his father with those serious eyes and then, slowly, smiled. From the nursery window, Amber watched Christopher help Thomas stand, watched the little boy take shaky steps across the grass with his father's hand supporting him. The security camera mounted above her head captured the moment perfectly, the angle ideal, the lighting clear, the timestamp precise. But for the first time since the system had been installed, there was no one in the office watching the screen. The monitors in Christopher's command center glowed with images of an empty mansion, empty hallways, empty rooms, empty spaces where a man had hidden from his own life. Because that man had finally stepped out of his tower of surveillance and into the messy, terrifying, beautiful reality of being present. On Christopher's desk, abandoned and forgotten, his phone displayed a paused video feed. The screen showed Thomas Miller frozen mid-step, his small foot lifted, his arms outstretched toward Amber's waiting hands. The timestamp read 11:47 a.m., the exact moment everything had changed. The exact moment Christopher's sons had walked while he watched through a screen. The exact moment he'd realized that all his monitoring, all his control, all his desperate attempts to keep them safe had cost him the one thing that mattered most, being their father. But the phone stayed on the desk, and Christopher stayed in the garden, and his sons took steps on grass and giggled at butterflies and existed in the sunshine while their father, finally their father, existed right beside them. The fortress stood empty. The cameras recorded nothing but stillness. And outside, under the open sky, three little boys discovered what it felt like to walk, while their father discovered what it felt like to live. At 3:42 p.m., Christopher's phone buzzed one final time. A calendar alert. Review security footage. He'd set it months ago, a daily reminder to check what he'd missed. Christopher glanced at his phone from where he sat in the grass, Thomas attempting to walk from his knee to David's shoulder 3 feet away. Then he turned it face down and went back to counting his son's steps out loud, his voice full of encouragement and pride and presence. The alert went unacknowledged. The footage went unreviewed. And Christopher Miller finally chose connection over control, fatherhood over fear, and the beautiful, imperfect, unmeasurable miracle of being exactly where he was needed most. Right here, right now, with his sons. 6 months later, the room that had once held 27 monitors and served as Christopher's command center was filled with toys. Building blocks covered the floor where server racks used to stand. A small slide occupied the corner that had housed the main surveillance hub. The walls that had glowed with live feeds now displayed the boys' finger paintings, chaotic splashes of color that made no sense and meant everything. Christopher still had security cameras. He wasn't completely transformed. Some fears ran too deep to ever fully disappear. But now he checked them only when he left the house, a quick glance to ensure the boys were safe with Amber, not a substitute for actually being in the room with them. The difference, he'd learned, was everything. "Daddy, look." David's voice rang out from somewhere near the slide. Christopher turned to see his son standing at the top, standing, not sitting, his face bright with pride and mischief. "I see you, buddy. You want to go down?" David didn't answer with words. He just laughed and launched himself down the slide, landing in a heap at the bottom before immediately scrambling to his feet and running back around for another turn. Running. The word still caught Christopher off guard sometimes. The specialists had said walking might take years. Running had seemed like a fantasy. Yet here was David, 19 months old, sprinting across the playroom with the determined wobble of a toddler who'd discovered speed and had no intention of slowing down. "Thomas, that's Steven's truck?" Amber's voice came from the corner where she sat on the floor between Christopher's other 2 sons. "Can you give it back and choose a different toy?" Christopher watched Thomas consider this, his small face serious as he weighed his options. Then, slowly, he handed the red truck to his brother and picked up a blue car instead. Steven immediately crashed the truck into a tower of blocks, sending them scattering. "Good sharing, Thomas," Amber said, and Thomas beamed. Amber had stayed, though the nature of her position had shifted in ways Christopher's old contracts could never have captured. She was still paid, generously now, with benefits he'd added almost guiltily when he'd realized how much he'd asked of her for so little. But somewhere in the past 6 months, she'd stopped being an employee and become something closer to family. She joined them for dinner most nights, knew which bedtime story was each boy's favorite, could decode their toddler babble better than Christopher could. And when Christopher had his occasional bad days, when the grief crept back in or the fear became overwhelming, she'd simply take the boys for a few hours and give him space to feel without judgment. "How was the doctor's appointment?" Amber asked, helping Steven stack his blocks back up. Christopher settled onto the floor beside them, and David immediately abandoned the slide to climb into his lap. "Good. Really good, actually. Dr. Hendricks said their lung capacity has improved by 40% since last year." 40%. She couldn't explain it. Said she's never seen improvement like this in cases as severe as theirs. Christopher ran his hand through David's hair. She asked what we were doing differently. What did you tell her? Christopher smiled. That we started living. It wasn't quite that simple, of course. The boys still had respiratory issues, still needed their medications and monitoring, still had appointments with specialists every month. But the trajectory had changed. Where once the medical team had prepared him for stagnation or decline, now they used words like remarkable and unexpected progress. Christopher knew why. It was in every laugh, every attempt to climb furniture they shouldn't, every word they learned and used with increasing confidence. The boys weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. Thomas toddled over and held up his blue car. Daddy, vroom. Yeah, buddy. Vroom vroom. Christopher made exaggerated car sounds that sent Thomas into giggles. 6 months ago, he would have felt foolish making such sounds, would have worried about proper language development and whether silly noises counted as quality interaction. Now he just enjoyed his son's laughter. I was thinking, Amber said carefully, maybe it's time to take them to the park. The weather's nice, and there's a toddler playground near here with age-appropriate equipment. Christopher's first instinct was still to catalog the risks. Other children meant germs. Outdoor equipment meant falls. Unpredictable environments meant variables he couldn't control. But he caught himself before the automatic no could form. What kind of equipment? Swings. Small slides. A sandbox. All designed for their age group. Amber watched him process this. We could go early, when it's less crowded. Bring hand sanitizer. Stay close. Okay, Christopher said, and the word felt like freedom. Let's try it tomorrow. Stephen had managed to stack 4 blocks before David's enthusiastic help sent them tumbling again. Stephen's face screwed up like he might cry, but then he just laughed and started rebuilding. Resilience, Christopher thought. His sons were learning resilience, learning that things could fall apart and be rebuilt, that setbacks were temporary, that joy could be found in the process, not just the outcome. They were learning things he was only now relearning himself. Daddy. Thomas tugged on Christopher's sleeve. Up. Christopher lifted Thomas onto his shoulders, something else the old protocols would have forbidden, and stood carefully. Thomas gripped his hair and giggled as Christopher spun in a slow circle. From this vantage point, Christopher could see the whole room. The toys scattered across the floor. Amber helping David and Stephen build a block tower together. The finger paintings on the walls. The windows showing the garden where they'd spent the morning, where grass stains now marked the boys' clothes and dirt smudged their hands. Evidence of life being lived, not just monitored. He thought about Emma sometimes. Wondered what she'd think of the man he'd become, the father he was learning to be. He liked to believe she'd be proud, that she'd see how he'd kept his promise, the one he'd made that night in the garden when he'd finally chosen happiness over safety. Both, he'd learned. His sons could have both. You okay? Amber asked, catching his expression. Yeah. Christopher bounced Thomas gently on his shoulders, earning another giggle. Just thinking about how different everything is. Different good or different scary. Both, he admitted. But mostly good. David abandoned the blocks and made a beeline for Christopher's legs, wrapping his small arms around one knee. Stephen followed, claiming the other knee. Christopher stood there with one son on his shoulders and 2 clinging to his legs, unable to move and completely okay with that. This was what Emma had wanted. Not perfection, not safety at the cost of everything else. Just this, 3 boys learning to run and climb and speak, doing all the things the specialists said might be impossible, because someone had believed in them when their father was too broken to hope, and because that father had finally learned that love required more than surveillance. It required courage, vulnerability, the willingness to step out from behind the screens and into the beautiful, terrifying, messy reality of actually living. Daddy down, Thomas commanded from his perch. Christopher carefully lowered him to the floor and watched all 3 boys immediately run to the slide, their laughter filling the room that had once held only the glow of monitors and the hum of surveillance equipment. He didn't record the moment, didn't pull out his phone to capture it. He just stood there, present and whole, and let himself feel the joy of being exactly where he needed to be. Right here, right now, with his sons, living. To all my amazing viewers, thank you. Every time you watch, like, and share my videos, you keep the echoes of love alive. Your support, your comments, and your time mean more than you know. This channel exists because of you. I appreciate you deeply.